Was gripped by one of Britain's most prolific sex attackers.
He was so meticulously planned as to disclose a huge degree of evil and malevolence.
A vile predator who hid behind a trusted profession to drug, rape or assault over 100 women.
He's committed offences over a whole number of years. A whole range of people's lives have been seriously affected.
We've got out of the main sort of centre of London, and I just started feeling very nauseous and very sick. I knew something wasn't right.
His crimes went undetected, baffling police for over 5 years.
Because they were dealing with a black cab driver, he couldn't possibly have committed this offence.
I had never dealt with a case with 102 victims. I very much doubt many detectives have.
This is the shocking case of the black cab rapist. 2002 marked the beginning of a series of sinister attacks on the streets of London. Appalling crimes which went unsolved for 5 years. It would result in the conviction of Britain's most prolific serial sex attacker. On almost every night of the year in the centre of London, people jump into one of 25,000 black taxis for a speedy and safe journey home.
Black cabs are well regulated. They do have a very good reputation. At that time there was a lot of publicity around don't use a mini cab, don't use an unregulated cab, use a black cab. So when you see the black cab roll up with that orange sign that says taxi, that's safety.
This cabbie was using the cover of a trusted profession to commit unspeakable crimes. In the summer of 2002, a young woman claimed she was drugged and attacked on one such journey home. Many similar incidents were to go undetected right across Greater London over the next few years.
We believe 14 women separately reported being drugged or assaulted by a black cab driver over that period.
The overwhelming percentage of the women were picked up in central London. You're looking at Westminster, you're looking at Soho, some around train stations just to the South London Bridge and that kind of area.
Disturbingly, none of these victims could remember their journey. What happened to them was a complete mystery.
They had very good memories of everything that had happened in the course of that evening, prior to getting into the cab and in the cab, up to the point at which the drugs started to take hold.
The striking features in this case is how few victims actually came forward at the time.
Sarah Craigie was one such person. A routine night out in the capital would become one she will never forget.
I'd been out to a club with my boyfriend and had quite a few drinks. I'd come out of Leicester Square, had a bit of an argument. I've walked off in one direction, he's walked off in another. Went to the first taxi and asked him how much it would be to get a cab back to Dagenham. What would normally cost £80. I told him I only had £30 on me, and he said that was not a problem, that he'd rather me get home safely and rather than getting one of these dodgy cabs. I just thought because he was a licensed black taxi driver that he was looking out for me.
As Sarah's journey began, everything seemed normal, but her cabbie's conversation would prove to have a familiar ring.
Then as we were sort of driving out of London, that's when he told me that he'd won at the horses and did I want to help him celebrate. He told me he had champagne, vodka, whiskey, and I just asked for a soft drink and he gave me a can of Coke and passed it through the window and it was open. We'd got out of the main sort of centre of London and I just started feeling very nauseous and very sick. I knew something wasn't right.
Barely managing to remain conscious, she attempted a cry for help.
I texted my boyfriend and I just said to him, I know we've had a big argument, but I need you to meet me, something's not right.
Having driven outside the city, the driver informed Sarah he needed to pull over for a toilet break.
I thought it was a bit strange because I've never had that before with a black taxi or any taxi. It was like quite a secluded housing estate. I was sitting there for about, I'd say it was a couple of minutes, and then the next thing he'd opened the back door next to me and got in beside me. He just showed me the bag of money and showed me what he'd won and just said, like, you're going to help me celebrate, and sort of just sat next to me with a glass of champagne. It wasn't until he sort of sat in the back of the car and showed me this money, this is when my alarm bell started ringing. And I swore at him and said, it's not effing right. That's when he snapped and said, don't get out your pram, I only want to celebrate with you, I'll take you home. And was sort of huffing and puffing and got out of the car and got into the front of the car to drive me back.
In silence, the cabbie drove her back towards her home in Dagenham.
As he turned in, my boyfriend had walked out of the car, got out of his car and sort of walked in the middle of the road and said, like, to stop the taxi. And he said, what does this monkey want? And I said, that's my boyfriend. My boyfriend got me out of the car, he had to physically carry me out of the car, put me into his car and he took me home. And I woke up the following morning and I felt so ill. I felt like all disorientated, as I say, very sick, and that's when I phoned my parents and told my parents what had happened.
Sarah had a lucky escape, but like many victims, she didn't report the incident at the time. What no one knew was that many other women were having similar experiences with a black cabbie who had a meticulous plan to drug and rape powerless victims.
He'd had a methodology that he's refined over time, and it's a very clear methodology, and it's clearly one that served its purpose for him. The vast majority of women who he picked up late in the evening or going into the early morning of the following day. He would always come up with a similar sort of patter about, you're my last call of the night, I live very close to where you live, I'm going your way anyway, if you want me to give you a lift it's not a problem, and often offering reduced fare or sometimes no fare.
As soon as a female agreed to take his cab, he could begin his well-rehearsed plan.
Right from the beginning, he would try and develop a rapport. A lot of the women said that he would call them by their first name. He would ask them lots of questions. They didn't feel threatened by him. They felt that he was someone that could be trusted.
They weren't stupid women either. A number of them were young professionals. But I think part of the sexualisation of that is controlling those sorts of women.
He always targeted women who looked like they'd had a drink or two, because he knew that they'd be more relaxed, they'd be more trusting, they'd be more confident. And then he would pretend to be a bit lonely. He'd claim to have won the lottery or won at a casino or won on the horses, and basically ask for them to celebrate with him.
His cover story was so well thought out, he even showed off his fake winnings.
He would show them a bag full of cash, full of 5s and 10s and £20 notes. That convinced them, well, he's actually real. This guy has won the lottery. A number said they felt sorry for him and they felt they would have a drink with him because he clearly wanted to celebrate.
The drinks contained enough drugs to knock them out for at least 2 hours.
In the front of his taxi, he kept his toolkits, his bottles and his cups, and what he would do, he would ask the ladies if they would like a drink, and he would have a selection of drinks available for them.
This was so meticulously planned as to disclose a huge degree of evil and malevolence. I mean, this was a kit which he took out with him, presumably every night, on the off chance that this would happen, and then homed in on particular victims and committed these desperate offences upon them.
Nearly every single woman who he did try this on with did accept a drink, and the next thing they would know would be feeling unconscious, sliding into sleep.
The vast majority of attacks were never reported, and those victims who did contact the police were often met with scepticism.
Once they couldn't remember anything, that reporting this the next day became an almost impossible task. If you went into a police station and said, I had a really strange experience yesterday, some cab driver offered me a drink and then I seemed to lose consciousness, I think the police would say, well, I'm sorry, but we're not sure a criminal offence has been committed.
No one was aware of the extent of these attacks, but how was it possible for police to remain in the dark for so long?
Because he was a taxi driver, he was all over London, he was in the outskirts of London, he was in the home counties. So the intelligence, as it were, on these various offences didn't get linked.
There are 32 police boroughs in London. They don't always talk to each other all the time as much as they should. Computer systems are only as good as the information that is fed into them by a human being.
Right up until the end of 2006, the offences that have been reported to police at that stage were very different. The descriptions were very different. The methodology was very different. Effectively, they ranged from a serious sexual offence to a more minor curb crawling type offence.
In July 2007, one attack would gift the police the evidence necessary to catch their man. But would they follow it through?
The police, for years, had been unaware that there was a serial sex offender on the loose in London driving a licensed black cab. This was their golden opportunity to wake up and notice it, and they blew it.
From the summer of 2002, a number of attacks were being perpetrated on women across London. Little did anyone know, but there was a serious sexual predator on the loose with the perfect cover, a black cab. In July 2007, an attack with all the usual hallmarks was reported, but this time a vital piece of evidence was gifted to the police. A student from Greenwich University picked up a black cab in the West End of London. She was offered and accepted a drink from the driver.
Her friends had said that she hadn't been drinking. She herself had said she hadn't been drinking, or certainly not in any significant quantity. And yet clearly she was hugely intoxicated by the time she got to her home address in Greenwich.
The last thing she remembers is drinking in the back of the cab. She had no memory of anything else until the next day.
This is the first time that a black cab driver had sort of come into the frame, as it were, for an offence.
Once Greenwich police were contacted, 2 officers investigated her story, but she claims they didn't take her allegations seriously.
There was a kind of mindset there where, because they were dealing with a black cab driver, he couldn't possibly have committed this offence.
Police then seized CCTV footage from outside her halls of residence.
You could see the lady in question walking on the CCTV away from the cab and then up towards where she lived. and she was clearly unsteady on her feet, and clearly something had happened to her.
This footage would provide police with a vital piece of evidence. From the licence plate of the taxi, they finally identified a suspect. A cabbie with no previous convictions, 50-year-old John Worboys.
They had the chance to kick in John Worboys' door and search his house and catch him without warning. Instead, they knocked on the door, got no reply, and walked away. As a result, John Worboys turned up 24 hours later at a police station, forewarned and forearmed with a solicitor.
But this wasn't the only failing. Police were to make a catalogue of errors.
The officers considered carrying out a search of his taxi and his home, and they decided against it. And they thought, well, if he had anything, he would have got rid of it by now. When Worboys was identified and he was interviewed, he wasn't challenged about it. And he was never re-interviewed after the victim had made a statement. So there were all of these discrepancies that might have been put to him and actually weren't.
The officers never got to grips with the toxicology results, which showed an unexplained sedative in his victim's bloodstream.
What you sense is there was a golden opportunity to have caught this sexual predator much, much sooner than they did.
Police had totally failed to seize their golden opportunity, and Worboys slipped through the net. But who was this elusive cabbie? John Worboys was a single man who lived alone in Rotherhithe, South London, overlooking the banks of the Thames.
Worboys was almost a con man in many ways. He was very manipulative, and he was very, very good at pretending to be a calm, kind, placid man. And I think many of the young women who got into his cab thought of him as the archetypal black cab driver. Most of his female friends all describe him as the perfect gentleman. He'd stand up the moment a woman walked into the room. He'd send birthday cards even to ex-girlfriends. He was that kind of very thoughtful man, at least on the surface.
This very much is someone that is very obsessionally predatory, and is able to come across as quite avuncular, quite a nice guy, someone's dad.
In his early life, Worboys had an obsession for female company and made the decision, aged 30, to embark on a career which would give him access to women he desired.
He turned to stripping in the sort of mid-80s and was initially very successful. He did it under the name Terry the Minder. He danced to the music from the Dennis Waterman show, and he was earning up to £1,000 a week.
One of the normal guys, nothing out of the ordinary, bit out of shape, and not your typical male stripper, in my opinion. All the other guys round about then in their prime sort of trained a lot, and John didn't look like he sort of done a lot of that.
I first met John, I actually booked him for my niece for her 21st birthday party as a surprise.
And as you guess what, I'm one of them silly stripograms, right? Now, ladies and gentlemen, I'm rather a big boy, so when I do get it out, duck your head, it's like a Dalek. It's side to side.
He came in dressed as a dirty old man. He always came out dressed like that, because when the girls actually saw him like that, they used to sort of shy away from him.
Will you be gentle with me, because I'm more scared of you than what you are of me, right?
But then once he took his, balaclava off and his clothes, and he realised how good looking he was, then they were completely different. All the girls thought he was absolutely fantastic, because he was a comedy stripper. He wasn't a serious stripper.
John Worboys might not have been a typical male stripper, but his intentions were clear.
He was a womanizer, definitely. His act was get in amongst the girls, get the lotion out, get the bananas out, get the fresh cream out. It's someone who doesn't really know what they're doing, but they're using the job to meet women and get amongst the women.
When he was stripping, he loved the attention, he loved getting involved, he loved the after-show party where he would ply women with drink and have sex with them.
In 1991, Worboys met and married Jean Clayton, but this didn't stop him trying to procure intoxicated women.
His ex-wife has spoken about how he would follow drunk women home, even during his marriage, hoping to have sex with them.
The marriage broke down in 1995 after turning violent and abusive. Incredibly, even at this time, Worboys had started to experiment with ways of incapacitating women. Jan Reynolds went out for a date with Worboys after one of his shows.
After we'd spent the evening out, we came back to his place. We then, which I never do on a first date, never, but because he was so irresistible, we had a sexual relationship.
After a successful first date, Jan hadn't heard anything for several weeks, but eventually Worboys got in touch to arrange a second meeting, only this time he had some mind.
On the second date, he cooked a meal for me, and after I'd had 2 or 3 glasses of wine, I felt quite woozy, lightheaded. I felt ill. I never knew anything else whatsoever, not at all, until I woke up the next morning in his bed. And I asked him how I got there. He sort of laughed and chuckled and said, "You'd had quite a bit to drink last night." And I said to him, "No way." It was only about 2 or 3 glasses of wine, but I knew then that there was something not quite right. I felt very angry, very ashamed going home on the bus, to think that he could have done something to my drink.
I would suspect there are many other instances in the early part of that offending history where he tried various routines out on women until gradually they were more and more refined and got more and more specific and more effective, essentially. I mean, practice makes perfect, if you like.
Worboys was honing his methodology, but at the same time work as a stripper became harder to come by, and with it his easy access to women.
Over time, his looks faded. He got older and the money dried up, and also the access to women, particularly drunk women, dried up.
It must have been a bit of a blow to John. His phone probably stopped ringing. He's probably missed it like hell, the attention.
In desperation, he began to finance and star in low-budget porn films from a flat he owned in Bournemouth.
Neighbours at the time who remembered a string of women sort of turning up at this flat without an explanation, very strange sounds coming from inside.
In 1996, Worboys decided to change careers. A job which would give him access to the females he craved. He began training to become a black cab driver.
What is entirely plausible in this case is, as you have with some paedophiles who will go into employment with the specific aim of using that as a direct conduit to victims, it wouldn't surprise me at all if Worboys saw becoming a black cab driver as a very opportune employment device to procure specific types of victims.
One sensed that it was his whole life, that his whole mission was not necessarily to be a taxi driver and earn proper money, but to use his employment in order to satisfy his perverted lust.
Worboys had seemingly embarked on a job which gave him one-on-one access to the type of females he desired. But how was it possible for him to get women to do what he wanted?
Mr. Worboys was not an aggressive man. He was an extremely mild-mannered man. To achieve his aims, he was never going to run up behind somebody and drag them off the streets. So therefore, to achieve his aim, which was sexual, he had to think up a way in which his victims were going to be complicit in what he wanted.
Most rapists want some form of reaction from their victims. I think what is quite unusual about Worboys is he wanted pretty much prone, unconscious victims. So no interaction or reaction at all at either a physical level or an emotional level.
John Worboys had been experimenting with drugging women and had discovered a potent cocktail using easily obtainable over-the-counter pharmaceuticals.
One drug was used. In some cases, more than one. There'd been a combination of 2 drugs. One of those was an over-the-counter medication for insomnia. The other would be a prescription-only drug.
The amount of alcohol with those 2 drugs, the combination effect effectively, for a number of women was very, very severe. Not only did it make them totally incapacitated in the cab and completely unconscious, but very sick the following day. And that, of course, is the seriousness of the crime, that for a whole number of women, they're not sure what happened to them in the back of that cab.
Worboys' first known offence was in 2002, but 5 years later, there was no sign of him slowing up. More and more victims at the mercy of this cabbie and his drugged drinks. One woman was to experience just how potent Worboys' drug cocktail was. After a night out with friends in West London, she was making her way home. She's prepared to speak, but doesn't want to reveal her identity.
This black taxi pulls up beside me, and it was a really strange thing because I hadn't hailed it, but I just got in it. He immediately kind of went into this rant about, you don't want to get into a minicab, I saw you, I thought it's late, you're on your own, you look like a nice girl. He said that several times, you look like a nice girl, you seem like a really nice girl. He started telling me about this win that he'd had, and then I remember he sort of put his hand down to the left and sort of pulled up this wad of cash, and I really remember it being a lot of money, but it didn't register with me as sinister at that point. I just remember thinking, oh, I'm going to tell my mates about this tomorrow. They won't believe I've had this crazy taxi driver. He'd been waiting to kind of celebrate with someone, hadn't had anyone to celebrate with, and he wondered if I wanted to drink. I thought, yeah, I'll have a drink.
As the taxi got near to the woman's home, the cabbie pulled up in a dark and deserted part of the street.
I remember saying something like, why are we going this way? What are you doing? And he said, oh, I'm just going to pull up here and have a little drink with you, and then I'll take you back to your flat. The last thing I remember him doing was getting out of the front of the taxi and getting into the back with me. I remember this feeling of sort of slipping into a sort of unconsciousness and thinking, yeah, this isn't good. My next memory is 2 o'clock the next afternoon, waking up fully clothed with my shoes still on. Work had been ringing me. My boyfriend had been trying to get in touch, and I'd just been totally out of it.
Unbeknown to her, Worboys had let himself into her flat. He then woke up her boyfriend and told him to get his girlfriend out of the cab as she'd had too much to drink.
I'm pretty sure that nothing happened to me in the back of the taxi. I can't be 100%. Partly because I woke up fully clothed. I had tights and knee-high boots on, and they didn't appear to have been interfered with in any way.
She was unconscious for over 10 hours, but the drugs may have had an unintentional side effect that deterred Worboys from carrying out an attack.
What was really strange to me when I woke up the next day is that I realised that I'd wet myself. My boyfriend actually told me that I'd wet myself in the back of the taxi. Obviously, it was definitely down to the drugs that he'd given me, but could have been what saved me from something a lot worse, I think.
Despite this, her experience at the hands of Worboys still haunts her.
If anything traumatises me, it's the fact that it was such a hugely risky situation where so much more could have gone wrong and so much more could have happened to me. And I could have been seriously hurt. I'll never know what happened to me in the back of that taxi.
Like many victims, this woman felt too embarrassed to contact police at the time. Worboys continued undetected, but he began to do more to cover his tracks.
He started to give himself an alibi after he committed a crime. On one occasion, he dropped his victim off at a police station, saying she was drunk. This was all because he realised that if he was stopped or caught again, he'd have a lot of explaining to do.
I don't think there is any indication that he'd slowed down in his offending.
Gradually over time, if you're not getting caught, there's no particular or evident repercussions, you'll repeat it. If it's effective, you'll do it again and again and again and again. It might get more specific, but it also might get more audacious.
Despite his numerous attacks, police were still unaware there was a serial sex attacker. In December 2007, all this was about to change.
There was evidence for a number of the women that they'd been drugged. There was evidence that they'd been sexually assaulted. But only in one case did the evidence amount to a woman having a recollection of rape having actually occurred.
Towards the end of 2007, police were still unaware they were dealing with a sexual predator driving a black cab. But John Worboys was continuing to assault women all over the Greater London area. In December of that year, one attack would prove crucial. A young lady was out with a friend to celebrate a birthday and decided to share a cab home.
They'd been in central London. It was about 4 o'clock and they were in the Oxford Street area when two of them got into Mr. Worboys' cab. Mr. Worboys, as was quite common, dropped the other lady off first, leaving him alone with this particular lady.
Once the victim's friend had got out of the cab, Worboys began by appearing to innocently ask the young woman for her exact address.
It's been a common feature that Mr. Worboys asked the victims where they lived as they got into the cab. After he'd given them drink, they got progressively worse, and he knew that he wouldn't be able to communicate with them by the time he got them home.
Once he had established her destination, he could begin his usual routine.
He said he won £47,000 at a casino. This would be typical of his methodology, the way he would speak to someone. Again, he offered her a drink that she accepted.
Worboys thought he'd perfected his cocktail of drugs, so they knocked out his victims. But on this occasion, things did not go to plan.
She, in fact, came to very, very briefly in the back of the cab. All she could talk about was you being on top of her. And his face was very close to hers.
In addition to the rape flashbacks, there was other substantial incriminating evidence.
She was a virgin before the incident. The next day, she was very sore in places she would not expect to be sore. And she made a complaint to the police, as a result of which her clothing was seized.
The trousers were taken for forensic analysis. Police now had the DNA of the attacker, but there were no matches on their database.
There was the DNA evidence from the semen of Mr. Worboys, which was on her clothing, and that was hugely supportive of the account that she had given.
Bizarrely, Worboys returned to the victim's address the very next day in an attempt to cover his tracks.
He left a note through the door with some money in it, money that he said that she had left as his fare in the cab the night before. I don't know why he did that. I think it's entirely likely that he was concerned that for some reason he would be captured, and to put a note through the door to say, well, clearly I wouldn't have done that if I'd done what you're alleging. That would be the kind of thing that he would say.
Although police had evidence of this one attack, they still had no idea they were dealing with a multiple sex attacker. But after years of missed opportunities, they were finally to link the crimes together in 2008. One policeman noticed something which rang alarm bells.
An officer at the Scotland Yard Central Sapphire Intelligence Unit linked Worboys' crimes. This was just one officer who was smart enough and bright enough to realise that there was a pattern there.
The officer had carefully looked through crime reports from across London over a number of years and noticed some startling similarities.
There were initially two that looked very, very similar, and as a result of checking further, they'd identified two others.
Solving the crime became a top priority. The job was given to a specialist team.
They called in an elite homicide and serious crime command team who usually deal with murders, who are vastly experienced, well-resourced, well-led, and got them to look at it.
This team was led by Detective Inspector Dave Reed.
My job was to collate everything there, to see what the similarities between the offences were, to see what differences there were, and to see what evidential opportunities there were. Were there things that hadn't been submitted for forensic analysis, for instance? Was there CCTV coverage that we could still look for? And the reality is that for 6 days, we did everything we could. We identified a further offence during that time. A week later, on the 14th of February, it was decided that the following morning there would be an appeal, and we would go public. On Friday the 15th of February, one of the national newspapers ran the story.
When the police went public with their appeal, it triggered one very important telephone call.
A woman from a sexual referral centre contacted the police. She had treated the Greenwich student whose attack was caught on CCTV. Police had questioned John Worboys at the time, but never followed through. Finally, police had a name to go on.
Literally, as soon as we could get from where our office is in southwest London to Rotherhithe, he was arrested.
The police wanted to search John Worboys' house before he was alerted to the public appeal. But would they get there before he had a chance to remove any incriminating evidence?
When I knocked on the door, there was a short delay, and then Mr. Worboys came to the window and he leaned out. I explained to him who we were and I asked him to come to the front door. He came downstairs, he was just dressed in his pyjamas, and I introduced myself and the other officers, and we went into the address. When I cautioned him, he replied, "What's this all about?"
When police searched Worboys' flat in Rotherhithe, they found a treasure trove of forensic evidence and circumstantial evidence against him.
We recovered the bag, and the bag had a large sum of money, £3,680 in notes. In addition to that, you had a number of drugs, different types of drugs that were used, and various other things that he would have used during the commission of those offences.
As soon as I saw that bag containing those items, I recognised that this was clearly his toolkit that he was using when he went out to commit these offences. It was clearly items that were put together specifically for that purpose.
The officers not only found items which Worboys used to perpetrate his crimes, they also discovered crucial forensic evidence.
the DNA of one of the victims was found on a vibrator that was found in Worboys' possession.
Worboys was so prolific that even on the morning of arrest it would come to light he had attacked and sexually assaulted what would prove to be his final victim.
Mr. Worboys was still committing offences right up until the time he was arrested.
It meant that in a wardrobe in his bedroom were found cups. The cup had the DNA of the last complainant on it, and a combination of 2 sedative drugs in the dregs at the bottom of the cup.
Police knew John Worboys was the prime suspect in 5 attacks, but were unaware of the extent to which he had sexually assaulted women since he became a cabbie in the late 90s.
Police had to charge the first initial group of victims for the simple reason one couldn't bail a man like Worboys, and there certainly was enough evidence to charge him with them offences. But we were always telling the court and the defence solicitors that there would be almost certainly more charges to follow.
Police were in a race against time to build up the entire picture of Worboys' crimes and gather as much evidence as possible.
As soon as this story became public, there may well be a number of other women who would come forward and tell us of their experiences.
The case received widespread media attention. Police braced themselves for a response from more women.
The taxi driver police are hunting is a serial sex attacker who's struck at least 5 times.
It is a very frightening thing. Black cabs in London have a well-established reputation. They are very, very safe.
We had a 24-hour hotline set up, staffed by officers who were specifically trained in these type of offences so that they could record all of the details.
The investigation team was inundated with calls, and before long a staggering 83 women had been linked to the black cab rapist.
It's very unusual to get this number of victims in any case, let alone a case involving such horrible offences such as these.
Police held a huge number of identity parades to establish Worboys as the driver.
There were an awful lot of identification parades held because, quite amazingly, even though some of the offences were a couple of years earlier, many of the complainants said that they would be able to identify the taxi driver.
26 out of 60 women who went on identification procedures identified Mr. Worboys, which is a very high number.
The trial was due to begin in February 2009, but because Worboys had drugged his victims, would they be able to recall enough to convince a jury?
It was extraordinarily difficult here because of the fact that the victims, in the main, were unable to remember a great deal, and that in many of the cases they were only making a complaint months, in some cases years, after the incident took place.
Since 2002, black cabbie John Worboys had been using the cover of a trusted profession to attack and rape women right across London before he was arrested in early 2008. 83 women had now come forward with allegations, the biggest rape inquiry the Metropolitan Police had ever had to deal with. But how was it possible to get justice for all the victims?
We had to make a decision as to which charges we should take before the court. We couldn't charge 83 because we'd still be there now. We needed to choose those cases which gave a good indication to a jury of the type of offender profiling that John Worboys was committing.
The police emphasis on the strongest cases would involve 14 women and 23 separate charges, including rape, sexual assault and drugging.
Complexity is always the enemy of the prosecution. It assists the defence. We call it overloading the indictment. This is the most number of charges that I've ever put on an indictment. And I was somewhat worried that I'd put too many, but in the end I was satisfied that I had enough there. We brought all of the proper evidence before the court, and the court had enough powers upon conviction to sentence him according to his criminality.
Worboys pleaded not guilty, which meant all 14 women would have to relive their ordeal.
It went to trial at Croydon. It ran for 8 weeks. I think what was sad is that Mr. Worboys put those women through that trial. They were incredibly brave. All 14 women that gave evidence exceptionally well. But invariably it's a very difficult thing to do. But by pleading not guilty, he put them through that.
Because John Worboys had not answered anything put to him during questioning, no one had any idea how he would behave in court.
His demeanour in court throughout was mild-mannered, polite, on the face of it cooperative.
He appeared embarrassed to be there, upset, slightly confused. He wasn't angry, he wasn't threatening, he wasn't the sort of sex predator monster that you imagine.
He answered every question. He was in the witness box a long time. He was there, I think, a day with his own counsel asking him questions, and I was cross-examining him for 2.5 days.
Worboys was about to torment his victims one more time. In the cases where forensic evidence proved sexual contact had occurred, he claimed the sex was consensual.
I think that was really quite an appalling thing to say. Not only had he attacked them, he then made them relive that in the court process.
Despite pleading his innocence, Worboys was swamped by the sheer weight of evidence against him.
Even the best actors need a good script, and John Worboys ultimately had nothing to work with. He had no explanation for why so many women told such a similar story so convincingly. They were solicitors, journalists, PAs, educated, smart, professional women, and they told very convincingly a very similar story about their experience with John Worboys.
The account in itself was extraordinary, that a taxi driver should say he'd won, many thousands of pounds, hold up a plastic bag showing them the money, give them a drink of champagne, allow them to smoke, get in the back of the van with them, offer them a tablet on some occasions. I mean, it was an extraordinary story, that, and for so many victims to recount the same evidence was surely compelling evidence for a jury.
We were clearly in a strong position in that there was so much evidence, so much forensic evidence, and so much good witness evidence from these women that made his account entirely unbelievable, and he was convicted 8 weeks later. I want to thank all 14 women that gave evidence in the Crown Court over the past 8 weeks. Their bravery and their integrity is beyond any doubt.
John Worboys was found guilty of 19 counts of drugging and sexually assaulting women. He was given a potentially unlimited sentence, but a parole board can decide in 8 years if he's fit to be released into society.
He's committed offences over a whole number of years. A whole range of people's lives have been seriously affected as a result of his appalling behaviour, and the fact that he was sentenced to an indefinite period in prison is right, and it will require a strong assessment in a number of years' time when that comes up for review.
Worboys is behind bars, but the case has rocked London's police force to its very foundations. The Independent Police Complaints Commission severely criticised the Met for its handling of the attack on the Greenwich student, and major changes had to take place.
One of the issues the Met themselves identified was a lack of systemic ability to gather the intelligence and link offences, especially when committed across a number of different boroughs.
Wholesale changes include the centralised gathering of evidence from across London by a specialist rape intelligence unit.
We've reviewed all of the intelligence processes, particularly in relation to sexual offending across London, which has given us an opportunity to make some changes which I am confident are much better than they used to be.
Scotland Yard has completely overhauled the way its officers investigate rape now. They've brought in more experienced detectives, better computers to join the dots quicker, better intelligence gathering, and you can be absolutely certain that they will not never again dismiss an allegation just because it's been made against a person in a position of trust.
A total of 102 women have now come forward with allegations against the black cab rapist. But disturbingly, many still don't and may never know exactly what happened to them in the back of John Worboys' cab.
The difficulty is that there are a whole number of women who I do not know whether they were raped or not. That's the reality of it. And the only person who will know that is Mr. Worboys. One of my hopes is that at some stage in the future, Mr. Worboys may consider the plight of some of the women who he attacked and may consider speaking to me or to my colleagues and telling us exactly what went on in those cabs.
Former detective and child protection expert Mark Williams-Thomas investigates the impact of cyberbullying on children and adults and asks how the law could be toughened up to protect victims. That's the Tonight programme on Thursday evening at 7:30. Coming next, time to practice your Italian as Griff Rhys-Jones is off to Rome for Greatest Cities of the World.